What's up, everybody? Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm here live with my co-host, Misty Winston. And our guest today is Dr. Piers Robinson. Piers is a political scientist. He is affiliated. He does work with propagandastudies.ac.uk, SyriaPropagandaMedia.org, and PropGWOT, that's propgwot.org. He is a former chair and professor at Sheffield University, and he is joining us now from Berlin, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Good to meet you. Good to be there.
You as well. So, given that your area of expertise, if you will, is propaganda and propaganda studies, we wanted to talk to you today about the propaganda that surrounds the COVID-19 narrative that's been surrounding it, suffocating it actually since the very beginning. And just speaking for myself, it took me a bit of time to wake up to that propaganda, to see it for what it is. But it seems like early on that you noticed it. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that. When did you realize that something was quite amiss in the official narrative?
Yeah, I think my immediate reaction to COVID-19, what was we were being presented with what was clearly being presented as a major global emergency crisis. And I suppose instinctively, my first concern was that, well, when these things occur, you always have the risk of political, economic actors exploiting it, make the best of a crisis. Yeah. So straight away, I was concerned about that. And I did write quite early on for Off Guardian a piece about making a comparison with 9/11. And I think this was at the end of, this is about March, towards the end of March, I wrote this. And, just making the point that with 9/11, we had an event which was exploited, and of course, a controversial event itself, but an event which was also exploited in order to start wars. Wars which weren't really connected with the official justifications surrounding fighting alleged Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. And that with COVID-19, you have the risk of the same kind of things happening again. And that was clear. Well, the concern was there straight away. But then, to be quite honest, because everyone was paying a lot of attention to what were the very extreme policies being enacted, so you had lockdown being imposed across many countries, and some pretty sort of dramatic claims being made or suggested in the media about how serious COVID-19 was. I think you could be forgiven for thinking that it was something similar to the bubonic plague in terms of the way that some of the media was covering this.
Very dramatic.
Yeah. And so immediately there's this kind of sense, well, is there exaggeration going on here? Is this being overplayed? And of course, as I'm sure you're both aware, quite early on, quite a lot of scientists, quite eminent scientists, started to raise questions. And here in Germany, we had Bakti, who's an emeritus scientist with a great deal of expertise, raising questions about how the government was reacting and how governments were reacting. In the US, you had initially sort of a number of scientists coming out, questioning how serious the virus was, questioning the response of lockdown. And of course, ultimately, that sort of transformed into the Great Barrington Declaration, which was headed by Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, Martin Kulldorff, and Bhattacharya in America, and then signed by a very large number of scientists, making the argument that lockdowns probably cause more harm than good, and so on. And so there was a lot of noise coming from a lot of scientists who looked very credible that the response was incorrect. And I suppose that then reinforced this idea that you appear to have a lot of propaganda associated with this. And of course, simultaneously, before I forget, you had actual deliberate censoring of scientists. And so you had Facebook and YouTube, I think, sort of agreeing, or essentially pulling scientists off if they were deemed to have wandered too far from World Health Organization diktat and so on COVID-19. In Britain, you had quite early on the emergence of what were known as SPI-B documents, a behavioral psychology team who was advising the government. And the documents actually spoke about using the media to increase fear levels. So all of these elements going on, and these are all the warning signs that this event is being propagandized, or a lot of propaganda is being used. And I think I was, I wrote a piece for RT, and I think I'd given an interview with a British researcher, Laura Dodsworth, whose book came out this year called The State of Fear. And she did a lot of great work at talking to actually some of the behavioral psychologists who sort of kind of owned up to what they had been doing. And so I really think quite early on, there was a clear picture that there was exaggeration of the virus. And one could bend over backwards and think that, well, perhaps the explanation for this is that they're very scared of this and they're trying to make sure that people comply with things such as lockdown. And so you could say, well, okay, they're overreacting. They think they're doing the right thing, but they're using propaganda and they're exaggerating to increase the fear levels to get compliance. But they'll realize that it is an overreaction and things will calm down. And I think sort of me and some other people were sort of hopeful that might be the case. I think I also thought that it was so extreme. The lockdown as a policy is such an extreme policy. It goes against all previous sort of approaches to dealing with these kind of situations. And also it's so apparent how much harm lockdown was doing. That I was thinking, well, okay, they really are going to have to give up on this. And I think I personally, in a way, I was very busy with other research areas, but I was thinking that by early 2021, this should be completely unraveled, that it will be clear that lockdown doesn't make any sense. The virus will be completely endemic and treatable and sort of considered as we would consider any other sort of virus, such as flu or any other coronavirus. I think, by this summer, when it was clear that the policies, the doubling down on vaccination or injection, and also both on injection, but also threats of further lockdowns, and then this incredible sort of shifts in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where increasingly draconian policies being put in place. That's the point at which I think it became beyond any reasonable doubt clear that COVID-19 was not primarily a health crisis we were looking at. We were looking at an event which was being used in order to carry through major political and economic restructuring. And to be fair, some people were calling us out right from the start. I mean, people like James Corbett was calling it out from the start. I'd sort of hinted at it a little bit and then left it. People like Corey Morningstar, Whitney Webb, a whole range of really very good cutting edge independent researchers were pointing this out from very early on, or that this was likely. And actually beyond that, there were quite a lot of quite mainstream commentators saying this is not about a virus, this is about something else, just wait and see. But I think by the summer of when they were clearly doubling down, I thought, well, this is clear, this is going to get worse and worse. And there's so much evidence now that we have, and to put very, very sort of simply, and perhaps we can talk in more detail about it in a second, but you had this kind of convergence of this political, ideological component you could see with the World Economic Forum and these notions of fourth industrial revolution, build back better. You could see a kind of vision that was being pushed by a whole range of major powerful actors about our futures. And you could see how that was dovetailing with this, what has now become clear, that there was a crisis in the finance markets in the autumn of 2019. And one response to that appears to have been to sort of facilitate lockdown of the economy in order to try and resolve the financial crisis. But that then, by this summer, I think the amount of evidence that this shows that was integrating with the kind of political vision being presented by the World Economic Forum and other actors associated with that, which was the vision of this, essentially this digitalized future where we're all tied into injection mandates, or vaccine mandates as they call them, digital ID, and then of course this argument about how digital ID is a stepping stone to central bank digital currency. And none of this is secret, because they're all saying this is what we want to do. And
Out
WEF
loud.
is saying this is the vision we want, and the central banks are saying we want to get people to a central bank digital currency. Partly, presumably, this is a way of seeing of resolving the finance markets crisis. But of course, what all of that means, what this huge political economic project means, it means, broadly speaking, that we're running into the end of any meaningful democracy. Mm-hmm. The level of control that technology and central bank digital currency, everything that goes with that, and of course people allude to the social credit system in China, all of that means that essentially we stop being autonomous, independent individuals. We're no longer in a democracy. Huge concentration of power. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are now. It's for anybody who has their eyes open. It's clear that COVID-19 is being used for profound political and economic restructuring, which is being done without any democratic debate.
Right.
It's being driven by major powerful actors.
Psychopaths.
And well, that's one way of putting it. And it's not in our interests.
No.
Or it's not in the interest of people. So that really, and I think, so we transit from seeing just, okay, the propaganda involved with hyping in order to get compliance. You can see that going on now. It's clear that this is a propaganda event. It's a deep event, as Peter Dale Scott describes, where something occurs. Quite how it occurred might be open to debate, and we can talk about that maybe. But it's being used to undertake huge transformation without democratic scrutiny, and it's leading us, into very dark places now. Obviously, we're in a dystopian world now, where we're trying to, people are trying to push for injections onto children. All the while, you can see, high-profile scientists, people like Robert Malone sort of calling this out, saying this should not be done. There's worrying indications that there's a lot of harm being done, and yet there's this terrifying drive to get kids vaccinated. And there are no scientists or epidemiologists that I've listened to who have been able to provide a convincing explanation of why that should be done. So this is looking very bad, along with everything else, whether it's segregation, which we're starting to see, or whether it's in terms of the clampdown that we see in Australia, and of course, people being fired from their jobs. We're rolling into tyranny, authoritarianism,
nurses,
and worse.
Frontline workers, like they're the people that 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we were hailing as heroes, are now being fired because they won't comply with, demands. It's, that's what's really, Ryan Christian just interviewed one of them yesterday, I think. But yeah, it's
nurse.
crazy.
Yeah. And what really strikes me now looking back is how efficient the official machine, if you want to put it that way, was in rolling itself out and rolling its narrative out. I don't know how it was in Europe because I was here, but here it was like everybody just, I don't want to say everybody because obviously, as you pointed out, there were some skeptics, but by and large, the majority of people, at least from what I witnessed, just bent a knee to this narrative and internalized the fear. And within days, we were going out with bandanas on or the cloth masks on. We were bringing home our groceries and sterilizing them, wiping down the counters after we got the groceries off. Just these beyond obsessive, compulsive, irrational actions that we we're told were in our best interest.
And also really weird. They had really weird restrictions. Like I was just, I think it was yesterday we just talked about it. There was a time, at least here where I live in Ohio, everything had to close by 10 or whatever, because COVID's a night owl. Like, what does that even mean? It's all of the stuff was very arbitrary. All of the, even like the masking was very arbitrary, and all of the regulations that they had, none of it made sense. It was all very clearly, and that's what's really, I'm really excited to talk to you actually, because I mean, I'm an Assange activist. I'm a free speech activist. I am very fascinated by propaganda, and it's really terrifying to me how effective it is. Broadly. I mean, like for the most part, I think at least I think now people are starting to wake up slowly. But I mean, like Jesse said, for a long time, people really, and I know they use fear. But I mean, does that just speak to how good they are at this? Because it's terrifying.
I mean, these are interesting points, because on the one hand, it's correct to say that clearly there's a lot of organization surrounding the propaganda and COVID-19. Then there is this issue of this sort of how far it's reflecting a broader, deeper, long-standing set of agendas. So you have the sort of this evolution of the kind of pandemic discourse. You have the redefinition of pandemic in about 10 years ago. And then you sort of have this sort of the repeated appearance of these modelers, such as you have the modeling from the Imperial College in London with Neil Ferguson, and then in Germany you have Drosten and so on. And so you have this sort of idea, how much sort of work is going into sort of helping build the kind of infrastructure which will create a response. Of course, with COVID-19, you had this event 201 in the run up to it. And as we all know now, and actually we are allowed to say this now without being accused of being conspiracy theorists, because it's become mainstream coverage, this question of where this virus came from and the role of Fauci. Or the question mark surrounding Fauci gain of function research. And it looks like there is going to be an interesting book coming out from Robert Kennedy in a week's time on both Fauci and Gates, which looks so it will be very interesting. So you have this point, yes, there's a lot of organization going on with this, which shows how organized they are and perhaps how effective. I would say also, though, it's the event itself, in the sense that if you think of 9/11 and the war on terror, so people are terrified of terrorists, and they're presented with these images in New York with buildings collapsing and so on. And this strikes terror into people's hearts, that there are people out there who want to do such vicious things towards us. So that's striking a nerve in people. So it's powerful as a propaganda event. A virus, of course, it's not quite the ultimate, but a virus is really ramping that up and saying, right, okay, this is the stuff of Hollywood movies, like is it Outbreak and what's the other one? It's Outbreak and Contagion. Yes, that's the one. I always get these films mixed up, but this strikes right to the heart of many people's some deep-seated fears. It goes back culturally. I mean, in Europe, you go back to the Black Plague and so on, the bubonic plague. These are things which people are naturally inherently scared of, even more so than terrorism. Because the chances of being caught in a terrorist attack, but with a virus, everyone could get. How bad is it? How many people will die? It's the stuff of nightmares.
It's an unseen enemy too. You can't see it coming,
and you can't see it. And so when you have the government and all of these authorities in lockstep making these claims, and the media really ramping it up, it's really not surprising that everyone, even the most sort of hardened and most knowledgeable propaganda experts, will initially be concerned and scared potentially. So I think it's the event itself which is meant that there was so much compliance early on, because it's a powerful one. It's I always joke, it's one level down from there's a meteor heading for Earth, because that will focus everybody's attention.
Fear is a very powerful tool. It really is.
What's the other one? Alien invasion is all of those things. But so virus isn't far off that in terms of how it can mobilize people and focus attention. And so it's an event, and it's a claim which it's not that surprising. And you don't, in a way, have to necessarily be that organized. If you've got enough people shouting virus and hinting at it being something, it could be like the bubonic plague, you're going to cause panic, and you're going to cause people to comply very, very rapidly. So I think those two things come together with it. It's what has been used to sort of create this event, this fear of a virus that's powerful in the psyche of most people. And then the fact that, yes, there's a lot of organization around it, and that's meant that we've had created what we have created, which is, I don't know what the exact figures are, but talking to various people involved in organizations trying to push back against this, there's these numbers thrown around that maybe it's only about 20% of the population who really believe all of this, and that there might be up to 20% of the population who are actually outright resisting this. They don't believe it, and then there's probably sort of 60% maybe in the middle who don't really believe what the government's saying, but just don't realize it's as serious as it is, with these underlying agendas driving this, and are probably just hoping this will all come to an end. I'll get my booster and then it'll all be over, and so on, and they're not paying enough attention. And this has been argued in other similar cases, for example, in the authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe and during the Soviet Union era, that you had the same. You didn't have that many people who were diehard, party diehards. It's quite a small section of the population, and you always had a section who was opposed, and then you had this big section in the middle who were kind of indifferent. Mm-hmm. But then when the tide started to turn, they moved rapidly. And in the case there was the people who wanted to bring an end to the system across the Soviet Union. And I think that's probably, I wouldn't be surprised if that's roughly what we have. Quite a lot of people, and it's clear that a lot of people don't believe it because of this. I don't quite know how big the protests are in America, but across Europe, we have sustained regular protests going across multiple countries. I'm not sure of the numbers, but it's certainly significant and powerful that so many people are willing to go out onto the streets on a regular basis and protest primarily the mandates which are being threatened or being imposed. And so that's a lot of people. And so on. So it's a mixed picture in that sense. But what this all means is that although they're powerful, although they have a powerful mobilizing event with the fear of the virus, they're not all powerful. They don't have total control. And that's in a way what gives hope in all of this, that this can be derailed in the coming months. I suspect the coming months will be critical in America and in Europe for this.
Yeah. I often say, like, how many times does your government have to lie to you before your sense of skepticism kicks in? And I wonder that all the time and I realize that most people are not really engaged in what's happening. They may catch like 30 minutes of Fox News or MSNBC after working 2 jobs and taking their kid to soccer practice, or maybe they don't even do that. But it's still, it's so obvious that it's not like we don't have a ton of examples of them doing this to us repeatedly. I mean, it's over and over and over again. When anytime there's a story on mainstream media, or anytime the White House or the government says anything, my first response is they're lying, and then I go from that. And so it's really frustrating and depressing that they're still able to be as successful as they are with this, because while they may not have full control yet, they are desperately trying to gain it.
Yes, with this, I suspect, to the extent that you have a deep state security service involvement with the COVID-19. You have the WEF, you have big tech, you have big pharma. These are all elements in this. But I suspect, and Kees van der Pijl, the Dutch economist, has got a book coming out in a week's time, and he sees this is a very important element, that it's about authorities trying to gain control over populations. In the West, that's in particularly because of the levels of inequality, the economic problems, and the rising levels of dissent. So you look at France, look at the yellow vests, 2 years of protests. It's incredible. And so it's about trying to gain control. And into this digitalized, is it the metaverse that Zuckerberg and Facebook are talking about? No, this is about just getting complete control over people. And that's what they're driving for. But that raises, what you're saying raises, I think, an important point, that it is frustrating that you think, well, how many times we had to go around this mulberry bush? You could go back to the Vietnam War, and well, they lied about the Vietnam War. You can go back to 9/11, Iraq, WMD. They keep on lying and they keep on getting away with it.
Incubator babies, the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, it's repeated over and over.
It's repeated over and over. But my reading and my impression is that there are more people now, especially after COVID-19, who have woken up to propaganda and who have woken up to political deception and state crimes against democracy. And I see more people, for example, even from mainstream positions, talking about propaganda in the way that they wouldn't have done 2 years ago. I've seen people who, for example, who have always questioned 9/11, immediately realizing there's something up with the COVID-19 agenda. And I've seen a much wider range of people waking up to COVID-19 and propaganda, and then also looking back at 9/11 and going, oh, okay, and starting to understand that. And from where I'm sitting, it certainly seems that there is a rapid increase in the numbers of people who realize that there's something very, very wrong with our political systems. And, to put bluntly, and as I've said before in other interviews, most of our institutions of democracy are fundamentally hollowed out or corrupted. Whether it's the mainstream media or whether it's academia or parliaments, legislatives, all of these things are not functioning in the way they're supposed to be. And I think awareness of that is growing.
Yes. Do you think that's why they've increased? Because it seems like to me that they've increased the efforts to keep us angry at each other, to divide us. Whether it's the maskers against the anti-maskers, the vaxxers versus the anti-vaxxers, and it seems like it's escalated to the point where they're really trying to push us to fight. Do you think that's why that's escalated? Because they're trying desperately to maintain control of the narrative?
I'm sure that divide and rule strategy. I mean, people always point out that divide and rule strategies are used by elites throughout history. And somebody had a great sort of description of peering over the castle wall kind of thing. And you want to see all the people fighting with each other, and then you think, okay, we're safe in our castle. And
sorry to interrupt. I just want to add to that point, because I saw this headline this morning pop up on my phone that something to the effect, and this was either in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but something to the effect that COVID and vaccination is becoming more partisan. And I thought, yeah, because institutions like yours are making it that way. That's why it's becoming that way. You're developing that narrative and creating that narrative and foisting that narrative upon consumers of your media. It's not that it's happening organically among them, but I just wanted to add that to the point you were making.
I think that's an excellent example, and this playing the left off against the right, because I mean that was, I think, done originally in America straight away, wasn't it? That if you question things, you're a trumper, or whatever term they use. But you see it here in Europe with the left. Traditionally, the left has found it extremely difficult to understand what's going on, and part of it is because it sees anyone questioning the COVID agenda is seen as right wing, and I think those are sort of tactical moves, and certain things are pushed in order to divide.
You would think that the left would be encouraging the questioning of authoritarian government, and that's the whole, we don't trust the state, and now all of a sudden you have a bunch of leftists running around trust the CDC. I'm sure they're telling the truth, and if you don't, then you're a Trumper. It's so weird.
Yeah, it's a very difficult time for the left. I mean, so I'm an academic primarily, but I guess I'm sort of sometimes associated with the left. Maybe it's because a lot of the academics I hang around with are from the left, and I suppose I in previous years I would have said that's where my sympathies lie. And so on, but you can see that the left has really fallen down, and you saw it with Chomsky's comments, I think, a few weeks back on, was it Primo Radical?
Yeah.
And so on, where not really thinking through where do you go with this line of thinking, and you go to very horrible places. And I think the left has really fallen down on recognizing, as you just said, that sort of where's the power in all of this? Where is the driver? Look at the inequality, and actually one could be a lot blunter than that. And there are increasing numbers of left academics now who are speaking out. I mean, Toby Green did an excellent book on the impact of lockdown on the developing world. And of course, it's catastrophic.
The COVID consensus, I believe it's called.
Yeah, and it's catastrophic impact on working people. And I think people sort of are beginning to become aware that a lot of the left leadership is not really reflecting the working class. It's reflecting this sort of actually this quite sort of middle class, quite elitist bubble of people who haven't been affected by lockdown. For example, the British journalist, conservative journalist Peter Hitchens said it's a Chardonnay holiday for these middle classes who can happily work from home on pay, furlough, and so on. And yes, I think that they've really missed an opportunity in a way. But I think I kind of like think and sort of in tune with what you're saying is that with this situation and perhaps more generally politically, we have to try to evolve beyond the left-right and to recognize that the problem we have is a concentration and a corruption of power into, in a sense, an extreme center, I think is the term some people use. And all of us are victims of that, both on the left and the right. And if we can kind of change our thinking and start to develop sort of ideas along those lines, which do say that we do need to speak between communities, but recognize that we're the ones who are being sort of repressed or suffering under a corrupt elite. And I think one of the good things which might come out of this, if we defeat this horrendous agenda which is being promoted, then we get people to realize that the system is corrupt, and then we can look at a more thoroughgoing sort of rejuvenation of our institutions and rebuilding of our democracy. But then at the same time also trying to understand, sort of the people on the left and the right, often have shared interests and finding ways of building that community, dealing with the problems, whether it's you have problems on the left, you have problems on the right, dealing with those things which you do need to be resolved. But recognizing, in general, that we all have, shared interests in building society. So, that might be one of the good things. But for sure, yeah, you're right. At the moment that the left-right card is being played, science, anti-science card being played. And of course, most worryingly, they're playing this demonization, this vaccinated, unvaccinated.
Yes.
And there's a great American playwright who lives in Berlin, C.J. Hopkins. I'm sure you probably heard of him.
I was just going to bring him up.
The Covidian cult, and he continually reminds people through his work that sort of this is, we have been here before in history. And of course, some people accuse him of saying you shouldn't be making these comparisons with what happened in the Second World War. But when politicians use the language of demonization and segregation, which is exactly the language they're using, you can look at previous genocides, you can look at when atrocities occur. They always, in a run-up to those atrocities, you start to see that language being used. And I'm often quite positive about how we can get out of this, but I think big alarm bells should be going off when we hear politicians making these comments. The comments that Chomsky made, of course, about
let them starve,
and it was in such a hateful way towards and he clearly didn't understand the science surrounding it, but towards the unvaccinated, and this line that they can sort their own food out, this is hate speech. This is, it can be easily argued to be hate speech, and this is, people need to stop and think about what they're doing and saying, and they need to think about what happens when you stop acting with compassion towards groups in society and you start behaving like that. And yeah, I mean, I hope we're not going to end up in those kind of situations, but we should be very alert to it now that when powerful actors and politicians are using that language, as some of them are, that this can end in terrible, terrible places, and so on. So, yeah.
I've experienced that in my own friendship groups. I've had friends who have said that the unvaccinated deserve to be shot. or that there's anybody who is unwilling to get vaccinated is a psychopath, like a literal psychopath. And those are people who were like friends of mine. So it's not just politicians, it's seeping out into, you know, everybody. And the otherizing, that's the thing. It's the otherizing.
Well, that speaks to the question I wanted to ask you, Piers, that involves CJ Hopkins, because he made a good point a little while back on Max Blumenthal's show, Foreign Agents. And he said that a lot of this has to do with a fear of death. We all fear death to some extent. And with 9/11, it was arguably somewhat easier to conceptualize that fear of death. There was a tangible cause to death, if you will. You know, you could point to Al Qaeda or what have you, but here it's the virus, it's the silent enemy. And so, you know, to add to that, there's still this argument that's put back in your face when you start having conversations like we're having, like, well, I know people who died from this, you know, as if that's irrational or some sort of response that makes logical sense in follow-up to what you're saying. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that, how this fear of death has been weaponized as part of the propaganda operation.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that it kind of, I'd go back to my earlier point about sort of, you know, the fear of a virus is a powerful propaganda tool. You know, it's the stuff of Hollywood movies. It's the stuff of nightmares. And of course, it's, you know, there is this thing, you know, we're culturally ingrained. I'm not quite sure how it works in the US education system, but, you know, the Black Plague is one of the things that we learn about at school and so on. And, you know, these things are sort of built into hardwired into your mind from early on. So people are instinctively and naturally scared and terrified of getting a virus and dying. So it's in a way, it's very natural and understandable that people feel like that, and it makes it so easily weaponized, as I think you're suggesting. I do think that there's another dimension to this, and you do see this coming from some of the critique of the COVID-19 responses, that, and I do have some sympathy for this idea, and this is more sort of my sort of opinion or feelings rather than being something which I research or write about. But, you know, this idea that in Western culture we have, okay, to put it bluntly, in the middle classes, you have this obsession with health and longevity. We live in a culture which isn't particularly spiritual or religious, although it is, and, you know, I'm not saying that those don't exist, but say this middle class bubble I was referring to, the blue tick, you know, this environment, and academics form part of that, I think, to a large extent. This belief in, you know, living for a long time, of staying in good health, not necessarily being particularly spiritual. And, you know, I think that Western culture and those elements in the West have come to believe in this idea of, even if they don't rationally believe it, they kind of have this eternal life thing going on, that I'm going to live forever, you know, and I need to live as long as possible. And I don't think that helps or it makes it easier for people to be, as it were, indoctrinated by the propaganda. Perhaps this is what CJ was alluding to. I'm not sure, but I think that when people are that obsessed about health and about longevity and so on, and perhaps have at the back of their mind this kind of, you know, can I live forever? Maybe I'll get it lucky. I'll get to 70 and they'll have invented a cure for dying. And you sort of see this, I think. I mean, some people have pointed out that some of these characters, you know, the billionaires and so on, and you see these ideas circulating. You've seen them circulating throughout Western culture, of course. The last 100 years, the idea of eternal life and so on. So you can see how that kind of mentality means that people might be very, very sort of predisposed towards being very nervous around a virus. And I think that does, you know, I think this is a reality. We have a culture which, in my experience, is very obsessed with, well, in a way, becomes very medicalized. And that's not to say that I don't believe in healthy living, but that you know, you can live a healthy life and eat well and exercise, and you don't have to get tied into sort of the medical environment necessarily. But then doctors and nurses are there for when things go wrong and they fix it and so on. But we are in a culture where, you know, sort of there's this idea that medicine, for example, can
fix everything.
Everything it can, etc. And you know, and this just isn't the case. You know, people, you live your life, and then your life sometime will come to an end. And I
in
think
fact, and I don't mean to interrupt, but this just
yes, I know. I was going on.
No. But I just it's actually had quite the opposite effect, because people are now relying on medicine and they don't care about living healthy anymore. They're like, oh, well, I can just take a pill to fix that. And so it's had the like, we're not living healthy through, you know, putting so much faith in medicine. And you know, I'm all for medicine. I love science. I think science is fascinating. I love medicine. I'm very grateful for things that we have, that cancer treatments, and I mean, we've come a really long way. But at the same time, I think a lot of people have become so reliant on that, they're moving away from actual healthy living and becoming, you know, really quite dependent on pharmaceuticals and the medical industrial complex, you know.
I guess this is where the sort of it's the political economy of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what they, you know, Herman and Chomsky's model on the media and so on. You look at the pharmaceutical industry, they have interests and objectives. They want to sort of ideally get people on drugs which are expensive and so on. And I mean, I think a few years back that would have been called a conspiracy theory, but I mean, it seems that many people, and the conflicts of interest, I mean, I've completely lost track of this, but you see the conflicts of interest between the FDA and drug companies and so on is extraordinary. And that, I think you've probably both seen it. I think Jimmy Dore did a slot on it, was it last week? But this is it, the Pfizer sponsoring all of these US media channels.
Yes, they have commercials. Like it'll be like, you know, this segment on CNN brought to you by Pfizer, and then they go into some. Oh, it's crazy.
It'll be the most.
I thought somebody just made this up, but
yeah, and it'll be the most inane segments. Like they do those segments on Good Morning America or whatever.
Yeah, well, even like Boeing.
They're outside talking to people who are outside the studio, and it's like, this segment of talking to people outside the studio is brought to you by Pfizer, and it's absolutely ludicrous.
And they do that intentionally. They don't want to have a segment where it's talking about war, death, destruction. They do like the cute, like happy, you know, the guy won the employee of the month or whatever, or the school bought the janitor a new car so he doesn't have to walk to work. They'll do those segments because then it gives you like a nice warm fuzzy feeling about, you know, Pfizer or Boeing or whatever. But it's really, and that's what's really terrifying to me, is that in this country, at least, and I know just in the West in general, our media and our governments are bought and sold by the exact same people. They're owned and operated by corporations. There is no gray area. They're all intermingled. And that's really terrifying. And they're seeking to, like, I mean, with the extradition attempt of Julian Assange, they're trying to, you know, gain global jurisdiction over information and journalism. And that's huge. And I mean, they're already really good, as we've been discussing, at propagandizing us, making us think against our own interests, all of those things. But now they're going to have they already have almost all control of the narrative, but they're going to have all of the control. And that's a really terrifying prospect.
Yeah. And sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I mean, Kees van der Paal's book, he talks about, now, let me get this right, the intelligence pharmaceutical media nexus, which is in a way an evolution of the military industrial complex, which of course Eisenhower warned us all about when he was stepping down. And these actors clearly are operating on a global level, and you're absolutely correct that this is, you know, there's a globalist dimension to this, and the drive is, and I don't know how many countries are fully on board with this. That's one of the puzzles we have at the moment. I think it's fairly clear how this is playing out in Western democracies, but China's clearly been involved at some points, but it's not clear quite what its involvement is, other than perhaps in the finance system restructuring, which they will be cooperating on. It's an uneven picture globally as to how this is playing out, but for sure you're absolutely correct, is that the these entities who clearly have penetration of the World Health Organization, or Bill Gates, and so on, or the World Economic Forum, or even the United Nations. I think you have networks which reflect this globalist, as it were, agenda, if you want to call it that. And yes, the drive for our futures in terms of Western democracies is they want control, and the worst case scenario is that they want to get everyone completely locked into place with the digital ID. What's going in our favor on all of this is, aside from the fact that the kind of propaganda bubble might burst at some point, there is enough harm emerging from the injections to potentially derail. There might be enough scientists blowing the whistle, standing up, and so on, might help to derail it. But I also think that we do have a lot of organizations and a lot of people willing to go out onto the streets effectively across the world, but certainly in democracies, which means that there is the potential there. I think if those groups and entities are able to find ways of talking to each other and starting to mobilize together, then you're in a situation where you might be able to see some really concerted pushback against these people who are driving the agenda. And I actually do think this is what's happening at the moment. I think that what Robert Kennedy and the Children's Defense League is doing, they're organizing workouts. There is a lot of other activity in other organizations going on in other countries. And again, this point again, that people are going out onto the streets. I've listened to some economists who said that there's enough people who are not going to comply now to just derail any attempt for a digital ID. It just won't work. You already see conversations going on between groups about alternative social structures, building our own schools, building our own hospitals. That conversation is already occurring in some European countries amongst the resistance, as it were. And so I think we'll see how that evolves, but I think it's a priority that sort of people who do realize what's going on, they get involved with these kinds of organizations and start to do something and start to act. That's what we need more than anything else at this point in time. And then I would say that sort of politically, I don't think that the Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab or any of these people or the people behind them in big finance, big tech, they don't have a vision for the future which is in any way attractive to most people. The vision of this kind of the metaverse, for heaven's sake, the digitalized city and so on. That this is a vision of geeks, of people like Bill Gates. I'm sure they might be very happy with that kind of world, but it's not a world that most people want to live in. So I don't think they have a very persuasive vision of the future. And I think that more and more people, when they realize that this isn't going to end, that it won't end with one injection or two injections, it's going to keep going on. I think more and more people will realize there's something else underlying, pushing the health policies, and realize that, okay, we're being driven down the road towards authoritarianism or worse. And then you've got the potential for people to say, well, okay, we do want to claw back our civil rights. We do want to try to rebuild our societies in ways where just normal basic levels of respect for autonomy and people and communities is allowed, which clearly you don't have with this. These guys and girls, or whatever you want to call it, are trying to construct a society where our participation is dependent upon being injected every 6 months. I mean, this is most people will revolt at that at some point.
Yeah.
And
so I think we have that on our side and in our favor, but it does mean that people need to start to act, get involved, act in whatever way they feel that they can.
I fully agree with you on that.
Yes.
And I think that part of that involves understanding the economic complexities that are driving this. And Fabio Vigi, for anybody who doesn't know, has done a lot of good work on breaking down the economic complexities behind what's happening. But I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit, not go too far into the maze, but, just some essentials that we should all understand about the economic drivers behind this, because I think, as you've been pointing out, that in the end, this is about a very tiny minority centralizing economic control as much as they possibly can. And, you mentioned the financial crisis that was brewing toward the end of 2019 with the repo markets, and Event 201 happened shortly after that. And then all of a sudden it was this pandemic mania that was rolled out. But, Fabio Vigi has a piece at the Philosophical Salon that goes through the different economic events that transpired leading up to the declaration of this so-called pandemic. And so I'm wondering if we can just get into that a little bit, the details of that, and sort of give some more detailed context to what that's all about. Because a lot of people hear the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all these sort of transhumanist and even Malthusian entities that are really are behind this, but it seems so broad in scope in some ways that it's easy for people still to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. But I think when you really drill down into the economic events, especially leading up to the declaration of this so-called pandemic, it provides a much clearer picture.
Well, I mean, on the economics, I'm not an economist, so I can only really relay what the economists who appear to be right on the money on this are saying. And it is, Fabio's done some excellent work on this, but there's also people like Professor Werner, Catherine Austin Fitz, Ernst Wolf, I think he's either German or Austrian, who have been, and John Titus as well, who have been sort of really setting these out very clearly. But the broad brush issue, and this is a way that people can understand why the finance markets might be in such a state. I mean, in 2008, everybody knows about the crash and the subprime mortgages and so on. And essentially, sort of as simple as way of describing this, and the way that they've put it is that at that point, the Western economies were put on life support in a way. So there was just a response to sort of creation of more money to keep the markets flowing or operating, and that by 2019, the impossibility of that situation had been reached. You're just creating it's money which is not rooted to any real economy. It's the finance market. So the finance are dominating the real economy, and simply, you're just creating things which is not sustainable. So it's very clear, it's empirically that crisis was emerging come 2019, and from a kind of a sort of a lay person's perspective, well, it sort of makes sense, because there's only so long that you can sort of bubbles can sustain themselves, and when the finance markets become so detached from the real economy, and so on, that it's going to go at some point. So we're at that sort of point of crisis at the markets. And of course, we see this visibly in the West. We've seen it with the kind of, sort of stagnation and lack of growth that we've had for a long time. We've seen it in terms of the sort of the amount of debt and so on, and personal debt that people live with. That these are not really sort of very tenable, sort of satisfactory economic systems to be existing within. And so the things should come to a crisis again after 2008 shouldn't really surprise and everyone. Then comes how this is being responded to. And if we're looking at a stage where there's a profound problem with the economies in the West, and you require the financial system to be resolved, and to be resolved in a way which is going to protect the interests of the people who possess most of the wealth. And of course, remember, as COVID-19, as the lockdown started to occur, you saw this massive upward flow of money. You know, small, medium businesses going bust, and then the big companies coming in, buying them up, and so on. So you have something which is clearly working in the advantages of these people who are at the top of the pile. Okay, you have a finance crisis. You then have a response to it, which then ensures that they're okay, and everyone else below suffers. So it's a straightforward sort of exploitative kind of classic capitalist sort of moves being made, and so on. And that's that I think most people can sort of grasp sort of or get a sense of how that was working and so on to create crisis and then create this kind of need. I mean, that Fabio's pointed to the need to lock down in order to pump more money in to bail out the markets and then to stop inflation from occurring. And of course, he argues that they're still stuck in that situation now. They're trying to suppress the economy and so on. So you have all of that going on in the world of finance and global finance, and then you start to have the solutions to this, and the solutions, and this is where they're reasonably transparent about it, and this is where you see the central banks talk about both the need for everyone to be vaccinated or injected in the world, and then they also talk about the need for a central bank digital currency. And what that means for people who don't understand is if you move to a situation where everyone's on, aside from being injected every 6 months, but everyone has a digital ID, which is then connected through to a central bank digital currency, what this gives the power to the kind of power it gives to them is the power potentially to decide when and where you spend your money. Okay. Because all of your information and your actions are essentially surveyed, monitored, it gives tremendous power to authorities to monitor what you're doing, what you're saying on social media. And so people point towards the social credit system in China, which is being implemented, where they have the potential. If you go onto a website or you sort of say something negative towards the government, you can be punished. You can be automatically published. You can have your access to your money taken away, and so on. You develop a negative social credit score. All of these mechanisms of control, which come from sort of essentially your entire life and being and money being integrated into this digitalized system, which is connected through to central banks, digital currency. It just creates a huge concentration of power and a huge capacity on the part of governments and other powerful actors to essentially monitor what you're doing. And we had this after 9/11 because the Patriot Act came in then, and of course, as we know from the Snowden leaks, at that point bulk data surveillance was definitely going on. And of course, what that means is if the authorities are potentially able to look at anything that you're communicating in the digital environment, you're no longer, you could argue that democracy stops at that point, because if people are in a situation where they have no autonomy or private space, they can be monitored, all their communications can be monitored. You don't have to have authorities doing anything. People just have to know that that's the case, and then they will start to modify their behavior. I won't, perhaps won't sort of protest here or complain here and so on. It takes away these basic sort of liberal democratic ideas about the importance of autonomy and private space and so on, and just links you ultimately very directly into a political structure, which takes control away from your life. And that's how extreme this can become. This kind of solution that you see with the central banks and the digital currency connected to central banks, and then you see this sort of dovetailing with the political, almost ideological vision of us living in these, what do they call it, the wired cities,
smart cities.
You don't own anything, but you'll be happy and so on.
You'll eat bugs and you'll like it, Piers.
As Whitney Webb points out, somebody's going to own this stuff.
Yeah, that's about
so
8 years away, according to the official narrative. 2030. That's the WEF put that paper out, I suppose you could call it. It's 2030. You own nothing, and you've never been happier. Something to that effect.
No, we got to fight back against that nonsense.
So I think most people can understand. Most people have got a reasonably good feeling that the economies and finance markets weren't in good shape, and that the crisis in 2008 was going to come back potentially even worse. And that ultimately was unsustainable. And so you have that economic driver, and this is a huge issue. This is the economic, the financial structure, and globally and in the West having to be reordered. And then at the same time, this almost a power grab going on, and then you have the power grab from the pharmaceutical, high tech, deep state elements and so on, presenting this sort of digitalized future for all of us, whilst the top 1% secure their wealth, and then put us all into a situation where, wow, we don't have cash anymore. We all have digital currency, and potentially that's under control. I it can be determined when and where I spend it. I'm monitored and so on. I shouldn't break the rules, etc. That is straight into 1984 Brave New World kind of territory. It's authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and it might even appear to some people to be relatively benign for a short period of time, and so, well, okay, I'm being fed, this is all okay. But of course, the ability for further exploitation and terrible things to occur in that situation is very, very real. This is why we have democracy, or one of the reasons why we have democracy, is to guard against abuse of power and so on. And if we have that kind of world, there is, I would say that there's no telling to what elite groups might decide is in their interests and in the interests of the world. And somebody asked me the other day about, well, surely governments wouldn't do terrible things, and surely governments wouldn't do things. But I say, well, governments make decisions to go to war. Tony Blair and George Bush decided to start a whole series of wars after 9/11, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, but also others were discussed. But they knew when they made those decisions that many thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people would die, and innocent people. So leaders, people in those powerful positions, are perfectly capable of taking decisions which cause tremendous harm to people, and they often do that knowingly. Go and look at Robert McNamara, and is it the Fog of War, when he talks about his job when he's planning in the Second World War, planning the strategic bombing campaign on Japan, and he's talking about we were calculating how many firebombs we had to drop to get the city to really catch fire, and he said, well, we were killing 70,000 people a go in those bombing raids. And of course, he says in that film, he says, if we had lost the war, we would have been put on trial for war crimes. So people, for a whole variety of reasons in these powerful positions, can enact terrible things.
They're doing it now. I mean, I'm always confused.
This is
when
why
people...
I was talking about this, but without saying it directly. Well, go on.
But they're doing it now. I'm always, when people say, "Oh, you don't really think that our government," they're doing it. They're doing it right now. Flint still has poison water. And they're not the only city in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that has poisoned water. We don't have healthcare in this country. We are bombing a multitude of countries all across the globe for profit, not for any other reason, but for profit, for resources, to steal resources. We illegally occupy countries, we overthrow their democratically elected leaders, and then we rape and pillage their country. They're doing those things right now. They are completely capable of worse. 100. It can get worse. If you look at the things they're doing, it's easy to be disgusted and think that it doesn't get much worse than that, but it can.
Even with universal health care or Medicare for all, there's a huge vulnerability there where they can say, a government can say, okay, you want universal health care? Well, it comes with this vaccination clause. It comes with injecting yourself into this system of digital identification, of CBDCs, this whole regime, this centralized regime. There are so many things that people need just to survive, like healthcare, that this agenda, which it really is an agenda, can be, this agenda can weaponize those things and kind of hold them over our head as a cudgel, or a carrot or a stick, depending on how you want to look at it. And I think that speaks to, at least in part, to the danger, Piers, that you were just talking about. If this keeps going, and for all I'm seeing, it's still going, but I do believe that there are a lot of people waking up to what's been happening and who are just not going to have it. Um, so I think it's important to remember that the people behind, the people driving this, like Bill Gates, like Klaus Schwab, um, Regina Dugan, there's a list of them that could go on and on, but these really are just normal, fallible people, and we shouldn't regard them as, um,
Elites or
yeah, elite puppeteers, puppet masters. In a sense, that is how they are conducting themselves, but they aren't as smart as they make themselves out to be. I mean, if you read Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, uh, there's no clear vision there. It's a lot of hyperbole, a lot of just grand gesturing toward a future that is by no means certain.
Yeah, I mean, so some people are saying that people like Schwab are a little bit of a distraction. They're the figureheads.
Yeah.
Even Gates, these are the figureheads, and really the key players are sort of in the background and so on. And I
Yeah.
think that's plausible. But your point would still stands. I think that wherever you want to place the focus of this in terms of the driving force, the key actors and so on, whether it's people within the banking finance sector or the military industrial complexes, this grey network and so on, that whether they're smart enough is not for me not the point. I think it's more that they don't have total control, and they don't have they don't even have agreement between them. And I've heard this from one or two kind of sources that there is a lot of division over this.
Yes.
And so on. So I think, they're not entirely unified. They don't have complete control, and they don't have it fully worked out. And I would bet, we don't have to overcomplicate any of this. I think, go back to Black civil rights movement or suffragettes. You have enough people organizing, mobilizing, and standing their ground, and they can be defeated. And I suspect they know that.
Yes.
And I suspect that whilst as you see in Australia, Canada, and and New Zealand, but certainly Australia, you see this very coercive, aggressive crackdown on the population. The more that they have to do that, the more it delegitimates their position, and more it strengthens the resistance. And I think they're probably aware of that. And there is a possibility, of this sort of ideological overreach. I mean, I've made this comparison before with Iraq, that, one reading of Iraq is the neocons, they're ideological, that they thought everyone in Iraq would be terribly happy if the Americans arrived, and it'd all be flowers and peace. And that's a good example of ideological overreach, that was obviously not going to happen, even if, Cheney and others thought that would be the case. And you might have that with this, that sort of this kind of expectation that the publics are going to go along with injections, are going to go along with this. They'll be happy so long as they get access to the metaverse type thing. That they don't understand people. So in that way, perhaps they are sort of, ill-informed. That they're so caught in their own elite
I think they're
bubble.
caught up in their own narcissism.
Exactly.
And that we have to use that to our advantage. And I think that's, you were speaking earlier about, getting rid of the left-right divide. And I think that's incredibly important, because we can't even deal with our ideological differences or have those debates and conversations until we deal with the system that's designed to kill us all. So we need to come together on that kind of stuff. And it was great to have you on to talk about this stuff. I know we've kept you a little bit long. So but it was amazing to talk to you. We'd love to have you back to continue the conversation as this unfolds, because I think that it's going to get pretty interesting, especially over the winter. I think the propaganda is going to be an interesting thing to watch. So yeah, we'd love to have you back on. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find your work and on Twitter and all that stuff, so everybody can follow your stuff?
Probably the easiest thing is on Twitter. I mean, I have the Organization for Propaganda Studies has a website. But if you look me up on Twitter, that's got links through to sort of most of my work.
I dropped all the
on.
links throughout our conversation too in the chat.
That's great. But
yeah, I'll put it in
I'd
the
love
show
to come
notes.
back, and I do think that the coming months are critical. And
Yes.
you know, I don't think it's going to. We will know the outcome in less than a year, I think, of where we're going. And I do think there is, you know, if I'd say anything to anybody listening to this, is that it's time to get involved and to act.
Yes.
In whatever way, you know, you find that you can. But it's very important that people now start to stand their ground in all of this, because you know we're a key point in history, and that's not an exaggeration in any shape or form. So
it's not. It's
so
not.
good to talk to you, and very happy to come back. And
yeah, of course, we would love to have you back. Thank you very much for coming on.
Okay.
Thanks everybody in the chat for hanging out with us. And we will talk to you guys later. Thank you.
Bye.